The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
In talking about the causes of human destructiveness, one hardly needs to take much time to justify the significance of this topic. Some of us have lived through 2 world wars, which were in different ways extremely destructive. The first one more for soldiers, and the second one more for civilians. We have seen from afar the war in Algiers. We have seen from not so far the war in Vietnam, and we are still seeing it. We have witnessed destructiveness of an undreamed of degree, undreamed of before 1914, in the systems of Hitler and of Stalin. We see increasing violence in the big cities, in the United States, in Africa, in Latin America, and eventually we see the phenomenon of juvenile delinquency all over the world. And the question arises, are all these phenomena the expression of something in man which wants, which likes, which needs violence, aggression, destructiveness? Is it the destructiveness within man which leads to these results? Or are these results, are these phenomena of violence the result of social circumstances, of economic circumstances, and easily changed if these circumstances change? Or are there any other possibilities to answer the question of the roots of human violence? I shall try to deal with these problems in this course of lectures. I shall give in this lecture and in the next one special attention to the theory of Freud, and the most profound and most interesting one in this field. Some to Lorenz, although less so than I shall deal with Freud, and I shall then try to describe and to discuss the various kinds of violence and destructiveness which one finds and the causes for each one of them. But before I enter today into the discussion of Freud's theory, I want to give you a very brief survey, which will not take too long and which is by the way of introduction into this whole problem of the theory of destructiveness or the causes of destructiveness which exist. The theory which is most popular, although not among scientists, but among, with the exception of Freudian psychoanalysts, but among the broad mass of the population, not only today, but since many centuries, is a theory that destructiveness is a part of human nature which only by strict control can be prevented from breaking out. Let me perhaps a little bit be more precise about this theory and speak of this theory as the theory of the hydraulic model of the destructive instinct. Now, I have to explain what I mean here by hydraulic model, and some other authors mean by this. It's not difficult, really. You are more or less familiar with it. The assumption is here that there is a constantly operating and spontaneously operating source of destructiveness in each person. And what's hydraulic about it is that this quantity of destructiveness grows and grows. It increases all the time. And when it has reached a certain limit or a certain threshold, it tends to explode either to the outside, and then we have destructiveness against others, or toward the inside, then we have destructiveness towards oneself. But whatever the outcome is, be it outside or inside destructiveness, this kind of destructiveness requires release. And indeed, if it does not find its expression towards the outside, then it is a very dangerous thing to carry around, because it tends to make one sick. It tends to destroy one's own body, one's own physiological system, because this destructive force is there and cannot be avoided. In this theory, there is no need for a stimulus. There is no need for a special reason why the destructiveness works, because it works spontaneously. To put it in neurophysiological terms, it is a neural activity, it's a spontaneous neural activity which works without the need of any specific stimulus, and which has the quality of increasing and requiring release. This was broadly the theory which Hobbes held of man as a destructive being. It was a theory which many people hold when they see destructiveness and say, well, that's just human nature. It is a popular theory to explain wars, although I shall try to show that destructive instincts are the least important cause for wars, but there are many other psychological, aside from social economic reasons, which are very important. And it found its final and most interesting expression in Freud's theory of the death instinct, about which I shall talk tonight and perhaps still more in the next lecture. However, as most of you know, increasingly the Freudian analysts repudiated the concept of Freud's death instinct, and I shall talk about the reasons for this later on, and accepted another theory, namely of two instincts. One is a sexual instinct and one is a destructive instinct. And both are instincts which are conceived in terms of a hydraulic model. They have an inner source which leads to the increase of either sexual or destructive energy. Then comes a release, and afterwards things go along for a time until the necessary quantities build up again. There comes a new explosion, etc., etc. Now, the theory of Freud is rather complex and very interesting, and actually does not lend itself too much to popular thinking. But recently, another representative of this theory has made this theory very popular, and that is Konrad Lorenz, the ethologist. That means a specialist in the observation of animal behavior. Although that is his field, he has drawn many analogies from animal behavior to human behavior, and basically he comes to the same result. Perhaps some of you have read his book on aggression, and I'm sure many of you who have read it have been very charmed with his beautiful and charming descriptions of animal behavior sometimes so touching that they are not quite believable, as far as unless one puts human thought or human feeling into the animal. But nevertheless, that part of his description is always very interesting. The problem begins when he applies it by analogy to human behavior. And while he does not share the Freudian view of a destructive instinct, in fact, as I shall try to say later, while in many ways he opposes it, he comes basically to the same result, namely of spontaneous destructiveness in man, which, as he puts it, needs expression so that we don't have, for instance, destructiveness because we have political parties, but we have political parties because we have destructiveness. That is to say, the innate destructiveness of man tends to build political parties in order to find a way to express destructiveness. The same, of course, holds true for war. War is an institution which man has made in order to release his own innate destructiveness. Now, there is a third theoretical position which I have arrived at from my own psychological observation, and which has been accepted by a number, or I don't mean it, my theory has been accepted, has been presented by a number of psychologists and neurophysiologists in their own terms. And this is a theory or theoretical concept which I want to stress. But before I do this, it may be better if I put first the very opposite of this instinct theory before you, and that is a theory which is very much used and represented, especially among American psychologists, and that is a theory which says basically there are no instincts, and if so, very little, and most of the aggression which we find is not instinctively caused but is learned or conditioned. In order to give you an idea of the kind of evidence which is presented for this theory, let me mention one of the many experiments which have been done in this field. You put, for instance, cats together with certain rats. Now, in one case, the cats have been brought up with their mothers who have killed rats. In other words, they are accustomed, or if you please, they have learned or they are conditioned to the killing of rats. When you bring this type of cat together with rats, about 80% will kill rats. Now, you do it differently. You take cats which have grown up together with rats. No mothers and no killing. I don't mean there's any connection, but it just happens that they have from the very beginning lived together with the rats. You keep them together, and there is not a single case in which a cat killed a rat. Now, there are quite a number of similar experiments, and of course this is quite an impressive evidence that what in one case seems like an innate, instinctive destructiveness of the cat against the rat, quite clearly in the other case is behavior which is learned, or perhaps which not so much is learned, but which is completely changed by the fact that these young cats have from the very beginning lived together with young rats. What this early living together means is in itself quite an interesting problem, but we don't have to bother with this right now. I mention this only because this is one form or one of the one type of evidence which is used for the theory that the destructiveness which we find is a result of learning and conditioning and not of something which is given in the physiological organism. Now the third theory, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, is one which starts out with one undeniable fact, and that is that physiologically or neurophysiologically there is in animal and men a center for aggressiveness, which you can, for instance, see if you stimulate the middle of the hypothalamus of a cat electrically or by certain chemicals, that this cat shows all signs of rage and aggressiveness. But to assume this does not mean that you have to understand this phenomenon in the sense of the hydraulic concept. But you can talk about it in terms of a readiness which exists within the physiological system, a readiness for aggression or for destruction, which has to be activated by certain stimuli, by certain signals, by a certain type of experience. Or as one author puts it, what is really inherited and what is given is a wiring scheme, is the possibility of the activation of destructiveness, but not a quantity of destructiveness or rage or anger which is produced spontaneously, which increases and follows the laws of the hydraulic model. Actually, you have the assumption of this kind of theory already implicit in a man who is now very much forgotten, namely one of the leaders of the school of instinctivists, MacDougall, whose concept of the destructive instinct was not too far away from this kind of third possibility. You find among neurophysiological scholars now, let us say, a man like Hernandez Peon, who has a very complicated and very refined concept which amounts to this very same thing I'm talking about, namely that while every person has physiologically, neurophysiologically, the potential for rage, the potential has to be activated by certain signals, by certain stimuli, and if these stimuli do not occur, there is no active aggressiveness or destructiveness which grows and which has to be controlled. It seems to me that this theory has the great advantage in comparison with both the theory of the hydraulic instinctive theory and the learning theory, that it answers in the first place why aggressiveness and destructiveness can be so deep, because it is rooted in a certain given of the organism, but at the same time why it requires very specific conditions and signals to break out, and if they are not given, it is just not there or not to any considerable extent. The evidence for that it is not there, that we do not, that neither individually nor as far anthropology is concerned, that this assumption of the hydraulic model, that this assumption is not true, I shall try to talk about later in the course of these lectures. At this moment, I only wanted to present you with the general concept here of these three possibilities and indicate my own preference for the third one. And now I shall begin to present to you the Freudian theory of aggression or of destructiveness, or of hostility. perhaps I should say here that my having to use these different words is connected with one of the very basic shortcomings of the whole discussion on destructiveness and aggressiveness. Namely, that all this, the whole literature, deals with this as if it were one phenomenon, as if there were a destructiveness or hostility which ranges from getting angry if somebody tries to shoot me, or a sadist who enjoys to torture another person, or somebody who does not enjoy but who is attracted by all that is not alive and all that is dead. Now, I believe, and I shall try to show later, that they are entirely different phenomena. They may be mixed sometimes, but basically they are entirely different, and that we shall never understand the cause or the conditions for destructiveness unless we break it down to the various qualitatively different forms of destructiveness, because if we want to find a reason for something which doesn't exist as such, which is a pure abstraction, we shall of course never find a reason, or what is more likely, we find the wrong reason if one is busy long enough to go on trying to find the reason. Now, I hope you will not mind in this lecture, and maybe in the next one to some extent, to follow me in a somewhat difficult undertaking, and that is to follow some of the details of Freud's theory on aggression. This requires perhaps a certain amount of interest. It is by no means a technical or subject matter which is difficult to understand, and you might ask, why do I try to talk about it? Well, in the first place, I think among all the popular stuff which is offered today by people like Lorenz or other writers which are not even scientific in one field, it is very important to understand the one theory which has a high scientific level. And secondly, I thought it might interest you if I try to present you with a thinking process of a genius, namely Freud. That is to say, if I try to show you how and why Freud followed one path, got into contradictions, what happened to him, how he could not solve certain contradictions, and so on and so on. Because in trying to understand an author, it is the most interesting thing not just to understand his results, but to understand the way he thinks. Naturally, for a written examination, it might be, and usually is perfectly enough if you know this is a result. So Freud says this, and that's all you have to know about it. But one doesn't take examinations because it's interesting. One does so because one is forced to. But since you are not forced here and don't have to take examinations, I thought you might be interested to follow this rather amazing way which Freud has taken in this problem and the contradictions in which he involved himself and which he tried to solve and never did solve, and for which reason. So if you will have the patience to go into this, and I hope you have, I'll begin with a description of Freud's position and the development of his theory. And the starting point perhaps must be to state that until 1920, Freud paid little attention to human aggressiveness. It was not important for him. He writes himself in 1930 in civilization its discontents. But I can no longer understand how we can have overlooked the ubiquity of non-erotic aggressivity. Maybe I have to understand what he means by that non-erotic aggressivity. I shall try to explain that later. Until then, his main line of thinking was that aggressivity was of an erotic nature, that it was a component of the sexual drive called sadism. But in 1930, he says he cannot understand how he missed the existence of aggressivity, which has nothing to do with sex. And how we can have failed to give it its due place in our interpretation of life. He writes that in 1930, after he had developed his new theory from 1920 on, in which indeed aggressivity or destructiveness had become one of the major forces, in fact, one of the two major forces which according to Freud, directed and motivated life. Now, if one asks why Freud did not see aggressiveness, a man who was much less profound than Freud, and yet his pupil Alfred Adler saw aggressiveness much earlier and much more clearly, and Freud did not see it. Why was that so? Well, there are many reasons for this phenomenon. One reason is that it was very difficult for any European member of the middle class before 1914 to give much weight to human aggressiveness. This was la belle époque, the beautiful age. Everything was fine and as it should be. Life seems to be without major catastrophes. Men had lost that aggressiveness and cruelty which was ascribed only to the Middle Ages, to the Dark Ages. The working class became slowly integrated within the whole society and lost its aggressivity. And as far as the colonial people were concerned, one just didn't think of them. And one probably wouldn't think of them now unless they had forced the white race to think of them quite a bit, although perhaps not enough. But at that time, the world seemed utterly peaceful. And the only problem which really existed seems to be the sexual problem. That was partly produced by Victorian morality. It was produced by the way in which one brought up children. It was produced by the whole literature in which love and faithfulness and unfaithfulness and all that goes with it was a central drama which occurred in man's life. But to think at that time that one would live in a world in which the central drama could be that the world might blow itself to pieces, that one could burn and torture innocent people under whatever pretext, that before 1914 was simply unthinkable. And so Freud did not think much of it either. Nevertheless, and indeed in the one of his earlier writings, in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905, he wrote that sadism was, I better quote here, thus sadism could correspond to an aggressive component of the sexual instinct, which has become independent and exaggerated, and by displacement has usurped the leading position. Now, this is very interesting that Freud speaks here of this sadism as having become independent, but nevertheless, the main point remains it was a component part of the sexual instinct. And so the cruelty and aggressiveness was seen as something belonging to sexuality and which eventually would lose most of its power when the whole sexual apparatus had matured and had been unified in what Freud calls genital sexuality. Freud says, for instance, in 1909, in the story of Little Hans, he says, I cannot bring myself to assume the existence of a special aggressive instinct alongside of the familiar instincts of self-preservation of sex and on equal footing with them. It's very interesting how Freud expresses himself here. Namely, he makes a qualification and on equal footing with them. And if it's not an equal footing, he doesn't say what he would think then about an independent aggressive drive. You can see from this formulation, and this is really analysis of a scientific text, that he was not quite as convinced that this aggressive drive was only a component of the sexual instinct, and that he expressed his doubt by this qualification, at least not on an equal footing. And indeed, one doesn't have to construct. Because while he made this very statement, at the same time, he also spoke of an assumption that aggressiveness is an independent striving. For instance, he wrote in the very same essays, 3 essays on sexuality, he wrote, it may be assumed that the impulses of cruelty arise from sources which are in fact independent of sexuality, but may become united with it at an early stage. Now, you can clearly see here a contradiction. In the very same work, he writes, sexuality is a component of the sexual instinct, and at another place he writes, it may be assumed that it is independent and only later becomes connected with the sexual instinct. In other words, if one asks oneself, did Freud really, as he thought, as he wrote in 1930, never think of aggressiveness as an independent drive? The answer is yes, he did think of it, already in 1905. But while he thought of it and made a number of such remarks, it did not become integrated into his theory. It remained outside. It remained a remark which was not taken up any further by him, and less so, of course, by his pupils, who had less imagination and daring. And so it remains just a fact that Freud saw the phenomenon and yet did not follow up what he saw. Now you might ask here, why was that so? Is the answer which I gave first, namely that this Belle Epoque did not lend itself to understanding how important destructiveness was in man, is that really enough? If that were enough, then why did he see it at all? Well, this question might be answered because one could say, yes, it was enough not to get more than a glimpse of it, and it lent itself to forget it again. But you might also add another answer, and that is that Freud was absolutely obsessed by the necessity to think in terms of polarity. He had to have 2 poles, 2 contradictions, 2 drives which fought with each other. And you can go through his whole work from the beginning to the end. You have always a struggle of light and darkness, if you put it in terms of the old Persian religion, of two opposite forces which fight with each other, which intermingle, which produce certain reactions. You might say, in a certain sense, there was always a dialectic concept, and the least thing which Freud would ever accept was a monistic explanation, in which he would say one thing is a cause of other things. This is perhaps the most fundamental pattern of his whole thought process. And therefore, it had to be two. And if you had sex, and if you had the ego drives, self-preservation, there was just no place in this scheme for a third force, because it would have split open the whole concept of duality. And as you know, and I shall show in some detail later, actually, when Freud did develop his new theory, he put an entirely new duality instead of the old one. Incidentally, those of you who have read Professor Lorenz's book will see perhaps how little informed he is about Freud theory when he says there that psychoanalytic friends of him told him that Freud was really a monistic thinker, not a dualistic thinker. Now, they may be his, I'm sure they are his friends, but I cannot think that they misunderstood Freud that much, so he must have misunderstood them. Because if something is clear, then it is precisely this form of thinking which is so characteristic for Freud, and which has done in many ways created great difficulties for his theory formation. And it's admirable how he pursued his way, always insisting on this concept of duality. And this is one of the reasons why, in spite of the fact that he saw there was independent aggression, he could nevertheless not integrate it into his system as long as he had already two basic drives, and that was self-preservation and sexuality. Well, if you follow up his writings, you will find that this contradiction goes through his writings. You find it, for instance, in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes in 1915, where he speaks of aggressiveness in the very same sense, that is 10 years later, as partly, no, not partly, at one point as being a component of sexuality, and at another point of being an independent force. Now here I should like to quote you one statement from Freud, that is also, if I'm not mistaken, from Instinct and Their Vicissitudes, where he says the following: hate as a relation to objects is older than love. It derives from the narcissistic ego's primordial repudiation of the external world with its outpouring of stimuli. I read this because this is a very interesting concept which throws a good deal of light on Freud's thinking, namely the assumption that man, in his original narcissism, that would hold true especially for the infant, repudiates stimuli from the outside, and therefore hate is older than love. The direction of the move is against the world with its stimuli, and not for the world with which one can love. Now, this forms indeed a very essential problem of the development of children and the nature of man. Is a stimulus something which is basically feared or negated, or is a stimulus something which is basically desired and sought for? Is man from the very beginning eager to be stimulated and finds pleasure in stimulation, or is he afraid of stimulation and develops hate against the world as intruding into his narcissistic state? I shall not go into this here. I only want to say that we deal here with a very important question referring to man's relationship to the outside world, whether he likes or dislikes, basically, the outside world and its stimulating effect. And it is true, Freud's basic scheme is that man repudiates the outside world except in as much as he needs it for the satisfaction of his instincts. But otherwise, l'homme machine, this isolated man, stands here and repudiates or even hates the outside world as an interfering element. Now, in 1920, Freud developed his new theory, which changed the whole system and which is one of the most interesting developments which you can find in any theoretical system. Namely, it changed it from the old theory in which your duality was that between preservation of life and sex, and the two fighting with each other, to a new theory in which the duality was the life instinct and the death instinct. And the preservation of life belonged to the life instinct, and against this was fighting the death instinct. A new and entirely different duality which replaced the old model duality of self-preservation and sexual drive. The old model was one which is rather clear, and I think I hardly need to repeat it. It was a mechanistic model. Here was a drive, be it hunger or thirst or aggression or the sexual drive, a drive which was increasing and growing and sought for discharge. And here was the ego trying to control this drive, and if it controlled it properly, then life was more or less in order. If it did not control it properly, then you had all kinds of difficulties, including mental sickness. But the model is a mechanistic model of these drives which are in themselves always unchanged and which are controlled by another instance of the organism, and really the only choices are of that the control operates or the control doesn't operate. There's a third possibility, but a rather weak one, theoretically speaking, and that is that what Freud called sublimation. I won't go into that because that's a very complex term, and I don't think we should take the time to discuss it now. Now, the new concept was entirely different. First of all, Freud, or perhaps I should say first, Freud arrived at this discovery of the death instinct, that is to say, an instinct in man, in the organism, which tends to return to the origins, and the origins of man are the inorganic is inorganic matter, that is to say the state before life, that is to say death. This is part of this is the essence of the death instinct. Freud arrived at this conclusion of such a death instinct on the flimsiest of all proofs or evidences. He constructed a compulsion or repetition compulsion. He constructed that from things which could be interpreted in many other ways much better, but he assumed that every man tended to repeat what had happened before, and from there he came to assume that in every human being there was a tendency to go to the beginning or to return to the beginning, and that was death. So the death instinct was a principle of disintegration, the principle which tended to disintegrate life and to go back to the state before life existed. While on the other hand, the life instinct was a principle of integration of cells, of people, of human units, of the whole of mankind, and he called that instinct eros, or life. Now, what is the new discovery here? In the first place, Freud discovered here the intensity of death. He saw here for the first time that there was in man a capacity of destructiveness which goes much further than he had ever thought of. He really makes now an entirely new turn, not anymore speaking of an independent aggressiveness which exists as a marginal phenomenon, but as one of the two main forces, because what he called aggressiveness, what he called the death instinct was really, although that is a most complicated business theoretically, which I won't go into, was essentially what one would call destructiveness, either outside or inside. So he discovered the power of destructiveness. But then he discovered something else. He discovered you might say, he discovered love. In the first theory of Freud, you might say all the human drama consisted of the fight between self-preservation and sexual desires. Love had no place in this scheme. Love was at best an illusion accompanying sexual desires, or sometimes an aim-inhibited sexual desire. But on the whole, love did not exist in this system. Now here, for the first time, Freud speaks of love as being something entirely different from sexuality, as an independent biological force. And the aim of love is, as I said, the unification and integration of all units until the unity of mankind. In fact, sometimes Freud called the life instinct the love instinct. And the love instinct, or eros, or life instinct, are something entirely different from what he had called until 1920 sexuality. The L'homme machine, the mechanical man of his older theory, who wanted only one thing, satisfaction of his desires, which are rooted in his instincts, and only modifying this satisfaction by his concern that his life is not endangered. This old model of the L'homme machine in the new theory had been transformed into a related man, Love made his entrance into the thinking and system of Freud as something quite apart from sexuality and the instinct concept altogether. Because the love which Freud speaks of now, calling it eros, calling it life instinct, is not really an instinct in the sense in which he had used it in his previous work. As I said, the old theory was a mechanistic model. The new theory was a biological, non-mechanistic model, much more closely related, let us say, to vitalistic philosophers or to a philosopher like Bergson than to his teachers in physiology who had determined his thinking for the main formation of his theory. So we see here a rather drastic and complete change from one theory to the other, and not just from one theory to the other, but from an entirely different, from one concept of life and of man to a different one. And now one will ask oneself, so how did Freud explain this change? What did Freud say? Why he made this transformation? How did he admit, and in which forms, that the older theory was not valid anymore? Did he say he discarded it? Did he say it was not valid? Did he say he had seen an entirely new picture? He had changed his whole philosophy, his whole outlook from a mechanistic to a vitalistic biological one? No, he did not. And why? Because Freud was not aware of having transformed his theory basically. Freud was not aware that he had replaced his older theory with an entirely new one. Now, why was he not aware? Obviously, it wasn't an oversight. You can only say Freud repressed the awareness that the new theory completely contradicted the original theory. And now comes the interesting problem. How Freud tried to reconcile, to explain the differences without being aware of the fundamental character of these differences. And this is indeed one of the most interesting chapters in the theory formation, or in the formation of theory building of a genius. How he struggles with a contradiction which he's not fully aware of, tries to find solutions, and perhaps one can at no point of Freud's work be more impressed by his honesty than here, where he refuses to find solutions which would have been at hand, but which he could not accept for reasons unknown to him. And so he tries here and he tries there, and yet he does not arrive at a solution, and up to his death, the new theory had never replaced or was not even recognized as basically different from the old one. It was just a new way of putting things. And it is very interesting that most psychoanalysts refuse to accept the new theory. In the beginning, in the first years, the majority, I think, still accepted it out of loyalty. And then after 1920, more and more and more repudiated it. And built a theory of their own in which they kept the old model. Namely, they said, that's very fine that Freud, well, they didn't say so, I put it in a much more fancy language, that Freud saw the importance of destructiveness. But we simply speak now of two new instincts, of the sexual instinct and of the destructive instinct. So what most psychoanalysts, Freudian psychoanalysts, kept was the old mechanistic instinct theory, and what they changed was only to take the new dichotomy, sex versus destructiveness, instead of the old dichotomy, self-preservation or ego instincts versus sex. But what they did not change was the new way of thinking which Freud had introduced, namely of leaving the whole mechanistic model and arriving at a new way of looking at man in which love becomes aside from destructiveness, the essential force of life, in fact in which love becomes, and this is literally Freud, identical with life, in which he discovers eros instead of discovering sexuality, which one doesn't really need to discover, perhaps at his time more than these days. Now, I shall next time try to show you more in detail how Freud tried to integrate the two systems, the old and the new ones, how he did not succeed, and what the reasons are, at least in my own opinion, for his failure, the reasons in certain premises of his own. So we have now a short intermission of about 10 minutes, or 10 to 15 minutes, and then we have a short question-answer period. Thank you. There's one question: in which of his writings can Freud's discovery of love be found? I plan to talk about that next time a little more, and also then to give the sources where you can find it. So if you will wait until then, I'll answer the question next time. Here is a very interesting question, which I'm very happy to have, although it's one which is so important that it's difficult to answer it in a few minutes. It says, your thesis, instinctive man equals mechanical, neurophysiological explanation, loving man, non-mechanical. Why? Is no neurophysiological explanation appropriate now? I'm glad to answer this question because it permits me, at least I hope, to indicate where there is some misunderstanding for which I may be responsible by not putting it as precisely as I might have. I was not speaking of a neurophysiological as against a non-neurophysiological theory. In fact, I tried to say that in that theory, which I personally, which seems to me the most promising one, the third one, there is also the assumption of the neurophysiological equivalent to aggression. What I was criticizing about the Freudian theory and the hydraulic theory is not at all that it's neurophysiological, but that it is mechanistic. That is to say, that it does not take man as a whole system, as a whole process, but it takes certain fixed drives which in a mechanistic way are seen as rising or being lowered, and as against which there is another fixed drive, that of the ego, which suppresses or controls them. There is nothing new enters into this system, which I call a mechanistic way of looking at it, but not in contrast to neurophysiological viewpoint, which would search for the equivalence of what we find psychologically as aggressiveness or destructiveness. I assume at this point there are many psychological questions which neurophysiology has not yet answered. And so we have to go on with certain psychological observations without having the proper answers from neurophysiology. On the other hand, there are many questions which seem to have an answer. But this is not at all the point, and of course it's much less the point, and this was not intended in this question. I mention it only because this is so often misunderstood. To make a dichotomy between a biological viewpoint and a so-called cultural viewpoint. This kind of dichotomy is completely sterile. And while many people understand my work and that of some other psychoanalysts as if it was culturally oriented as against the biological orientation, this is just mere misunderstanding. Again, this would be a very mechanistic way of looking at things. This is either cultural or it is biological. Man is a living process. And Freud's theory, which I find very impressive and with which I disagree for certain reasons, which I shall mention later, about the life instinct, the death instinct, certainly has its very depth because it's a biological theory. But it is a biological theory which is different from the mechanistic physiological theory of his earlier work, which of course was not based on any neurophysiological findings, but which was based on that which at his time lent itself most easily to be the example of all drives, and that was sex. Because that was in the center of attention. Hunger was no problem, but sex was a problem, as I tried to say, and there the concept of aggressiveness was formed along the lines of the concept of the sexual desires. Here is a question: do you agree that human nature is not changeable, that the best man can hope for is to understand his nature? Well, it is difficult to agree or disagree with a statement about a concept which is so ambiguous as that of human nature. What is human nature? This has been usually answered that people have assumed that the way of behaving or the character structure which existed as typical in their society was human nature. So in peaceful society, human nature was considered to be peaceful, and aggressive societies were supposed to be aggressive. The real problem is here: what is human nature? Is that a disposition which permits many kinds of development? Well, this is really a topic for not for just a few minutes answered. But I should like to say one thing, since this question has been raised. By and large, we are prone to think that the main choice which exists in man, and again I would consider this a mechanistic concept, is that between releasing or controlling of given impulses. Now actually, this works pretty well even without much of a brain. For instance, we can control cats very well by a conditioning process, or any other animals, especially domesticated animals, are very well controlled. And it seems to me that human life so far has been mainly that of domesticated animals. That is to say, you might consider human history until now human prehistory, and you might have your doubts whether there will be a human history considering how things are going at this moment. Because the main regulative factors were not those which are specifically human, were not those for which the specifically human part of the brain and its complexity and size is necessary, but which can be achieved by conditioning, which works very well in animals which are far below the human level or even the primate level. This has been the history of man most of the time. He was threatened most of the time, sometimes he got rewards, but this process of conditioning is mostly that which, through which man has learned. Now, I believe that man has specifically human possibilities which transcend that which you can achieve by conditioning, which open up new dimensions which are specifically human, and of which I think one day neurophysiological research will also have to tell us a great deal. But you can observe it even by purely psychological observation. Let me give you a simple example which you can try out any day if you are interested. Many of us get hungry if we don't get our breakfast, and by 11 or 12 o'clock we are hungry. This differs, of course, individually, but there are quite a number of people who do get hungry by that time. Now, assuming you try to fast, which people who practice a religion is not so strange. Those who don't, it's usually strange because it has no particular purpose, and it might even reduce the working energy for big projects or whatever a man is busy with. But at any rate, if you try to fast for reasons which you might call psycho-spiritual, for reasons of your own self-liberation, of your own pleasure in not being bound by your need for food, or whatever the reasons are, but I don't speak now of reasons of health, which again is a purely practical purpose, then you might discover that you are not hungry at all by 11 or 12 o'clock. It is very well known that after 1 or 2 or 3 days of fasting, you are not particularly hungry, and it is quite true that by then there is already a change in your inner system which really explains the fact, or I think part of the fact, that you are not hungry. But you couldn't say that if you are not hungry by 11 or 12 o'clock, because it's not enough time to change your inner environment to a new kind of behavior. Now, why you are not hungry is simply because a new dimension has entered the situation which transcends or superimposes itself on the old dimension in which the physiological hunger reaction and its satisfaction or control is all there is. I give this example of fasting because it's a simple example which you can make every day, but you will find that there are many, many other human phenomena which all transcend the old pattern of instinctively given drives and their satisfaction. The sense of beauty, the sense of love, in fact, very much so in Freud's meaning of eros, the sense of integrity, of loyalty, well, all artistic and intellectual pleasures transcend this level of the instincts, which does not mean that they are not also, do not also have their neurophysiological substrates, but which does mean that there is a new dimension which has to do with that particular human development in which man is different from the animal, and in which he makes a use of this specific human brain development, which is so different even from the highest primates, quantitatively speaking. Recently, an author has raised the question, is there intelligent life on Earth? You know, that is a pretty good question, because indeed one doesn't see too much of it. But if you raise the question, can human nature not be changed, then you must look at it from a different standpoint. Can human awareness, can human powers, human faculties not be extended very much in order to introduce new dimensions of motivations, of enjoyment, of action, which are not the ones which you find in the old model in which hunger, aggression, sex, etc. are the motivating powers which are opposed by the controlling powers. And I think it is very much a question of the future of mankind and of the truly human stage which we may or may not ever enter, whether the traditional system of conditioning and control will be replaced by a widening of human awareness and of specifically human experience. Of course, in that development which we seem to be headed for, in which you eventually will not be able to distinguish between a robot and a man, this will not take place. I might say one could express the idea in the way that all that which a robot cannot or computer cannot repeat or cannot do is that which is a specific human preserve and is part of human nature, that is to say, part of the potential given, which to a large extent is not used. Here's a question. You seem to use the terms aggression and destructiveness interchangeably. Are they in fact synonymous? Well, I try to explain that I used them interchangeably simply because I was speaking about Freud, I was speaking about Lorenz, about the literature, and there they are used interchangeably, by and large. There are some authors which try to make certain differences, but by and large these words are used interchangeably, especially by Freud and by Lorenz. In the course of these lectures, I shall speak about the different concepts, different qualities of destructiveness, and shall try to show that there are very different kinds of destructiveness, and I think it does not matter so much to find the proper words and to use the proper words rather than to understand fully what these different phenomena really are. Here's a question: why didn't other analysts accept the new Freudian theory? Was it that they were more involved with the man Freud than his ideas? Well, I think this is a rather complex problem. One can see there was a great tendency to follow Freud. After all, the Freudian analysts are members of a large organization which has its own bureaucracy, which watches the proper use of concepts and ideas, although there are certain liberalizing influences, not only in Czechoslovakia, but also in the international psychoanalytic movement. And so there is a somewhat greater leeway for freedom, but by and large, when Freud postulated the destructiveness as a primary instinct, one had to follow. Now, I try to indicate, and I'm repeating it, it seems to me the reason why most analysts did not follow Freud's lead into this assumption of love versus, or life versus death, was precisely that most psychoanalysts were and still are so deeply imbued with mechanistic thinking that it was plausible to them to think in terms of two instincts and their control. This holds true especially also of the so-called ego psychoanalysts who try to find something new by emphasizing things which in the past were pretty well known except to those who were orthodox analysts, namely that processes of thought and so on play a considerable role, or what is called in the analytic nomenclature the ego. But they do accept very heartily this concept of the destructive instinct versus the sexual instinct, and therefore stay in this older frame of reference, having acknowledged, so to speak, the new discovery of Freud, but turned it around, or crippled it, if you please, in terms of the older mechanistic concept with which Freud had started out. I would assume, if this had not been so the case, perhaps Freud himself would have developed out of this dilemma and would have had the possibility to set up a new conceptual system which he would have recognized as being different from the earlier mechanistic system. But in some way, and this is the tragedy of Freud, he became the prisoner of his own organization, and he became the prisoner of his most devoted disciples. These devoted disciples are often a great blessing for a man, but they can be also a great danger. And I'm afraid in the case of Freud, they were a great danger because they did not understand the depth of Freud's thought in which he was capable of moving from the older to the later concept. Here's a question. According to Karl Marx, man is receptive to social stimuli, and social well-being is for him an integral part of any man's personal well-being. Freud, you say, understood man as basically hostile to outside stimuli. Is there any reconciliation between the two? Well, I'm afraid not. I think the basic theory of Marx, in which you have already the nucleus of a dynamic, analytic, humanistic theory. I have just finished a paper in which I was trying to demonstrate this, so at the moment I cannot prove it to you, but I can only make the statement as it stands. In the theory of Marx, man is seen as filled with the energy which is that of his faculties which wants to reach the world, which want to respond to the world. In other words, because I have eyes, I need to see. Because I have a heart, I need to feel. Because I have a brain, I need to think. Man's need to express his faculties and to relate himself to the world with the proper faculties of his is the essential concept of Marx, as far as energy and passion is concerned. While in Freud, in his first period, it was essentially the concept of instincts, and it is to a large degree the concept of an attitude toward reality in which a basically unrelated individual needs others as a means to satisfy his drives. Now, this is not so anymore in his concept of eros. There you have an original tendency to relate oneself to the world, to be part of the world, to integrate oneself with the world. But, as I said, unfortunately, this part of Freud, for the reasons which I shall try to discuss next time, has not really found a place in the thinking of the Freudian school. That thinking has remained basically the earlier thinking in which you do not have this concept which is characteristic for Marx psychology, or for in some respect for certain phases of Freud's concept of eros. Well, I think that will be enough for tonight, and we shall continue then next time.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.